what I want to talk about is supercharging your unit tests. How you can address the problem of missing tests. How do you know what to test? And what are the scenarios? And how do you go about making sure they're thoroughly covered? We'll talk about the secret formula that I've devised for assuring that you have all those tests correct. We'll talk about unit test method naming, handling exceptions that your tests are expecting, how to check those. We'll talk about some of the common problems like testing too many things, test code duplication, just a variety of other mistakes that are common. Then at the end, I'm going to go through Ging, since you're all familiar with Ging. I'm going to go through it and talk about how you would apply some of these techniques there. The biggest mistake that people make that costs them points on the L2 is missing tests. That is to say, tests that scenarios that should have been covered that were not covered. Okay. Sometimes people, time is a factor here, right? So you've got 8 hours. So sometimes testing is left till the end and you're hurrying to get done. And when you do that, you sometimes miss some of the scenarios. But also it's easy to get caught in the weeds, right? So you got a unit test. Okay, I'll jump in and test the first thing that I think of that needs to be tested and write that test out. And then I'll try to think of something else and write that. And you're sort of meandering around. And when you're coding a test, your focus is narrow, right? It's on this thing. I'm trying to get this thing to work. And then you have to zoom back out and figure what should I test next? And then you zoom back in. So that is a process that ends up tripping up a lot of people. So sometimes they'll do only success scenarios or only failure scenarios and miss the success scenarios. Sometimes you use the .NET Framework method and you aren't thinking about the common exceptions that could throw and whether or not you should test for those exceptions. And sometimes there are testing requirements that are stated, but you miss them, you overlook them. Some of the smaller ones, for example, it's easy to miss them and not think about it. So let's talk about code coverage. You might be thinking, well, I got a percentage thing here, right? And it tells me if I've got the coverage. If I've got the coverage, I'm good. That could land you in the failure category for the L2, okay? I think that way more important than this percentage is whether or not you're testing the right things, right? Are they good tests? If they're not good tests, if they're not covering the common scenarios, then that's not helpful, okay? So this percentage should be taken lightly. This is Shiv's thing. You may have heard him say it before. I happen to think it's the wisest thing he's ever said. Take that as you will. Not everything that can be measured is valuable, and not everything that's valuable can be measured, right? I was amazed, maybe I keep my voice down. I was amazed at how, we recently got this email about raising quality in code and so forth, and all of that's great. But I was astonished at how something so subjective could easily be boiled down to points and percentages, right? We do the best we can and try to reflect up to management what is happening. But ultimately, these are very subjective things. And good code test coverage is not going to be the same for every person. Two people may cover the code nicely with their tests, and they be somewhat different, right? So there is subjectivity here. But when that's the case, you can't necessarily measure it with a nice tidy percentage, okay? So now, if you do get a low number, then I think you can assume straight away you're definitely missing stuff, right? But a high number doesn't mean you're done, okay? A high number just means you're on your way to getting done, maybe. So forget the number. Focus on the user story, okay? I want you to think not in terms of code coverage, but in terms of user story scenarios. All right, so what tests do you expect? Here's the user story. The service should return a specified number of policies sorted by ID. So tell me, what kinds of unit tests would you expect for a user story like this?
Does it return a list? Is it sorted?
Okay, good. So, Account. Okay, good. You might have policy, get policies when passing 5. Oh, wait. Should specify a number of policies. When passing 5, should return a list with 5 policies, right? Policy, get policies. When passing 0, it should return an empty list. None of you happen to mention that offhand, but that's a good test, right? Policy, get policies when passing negative number should throw an argument exception. Make sense? So you can see that what immediately pops to mind, or when you're working on code and you zoom back out and what you think you need to do next and whether you're done or not, you may not be thinking at that global level well enough. Also, policy, get policies when more than one should return a sorted list. So here's where you actually check the sorting. The sorting might be something that you'd miss. Now this is a short one, so you probably won't miss it. But if it's more involved and you have that sorted by ID embedded somewhere in there, it'd be easy to miss that. Okay? So you've got to watch all of the requirements. Sure.
So on the previous example, the example requirement didn't say what to do.
That's right. That's right.
With the test have that.
Yes, and we'll talk about that later because not everything is in the user story, right? So that's right. It didn't say, but are you going to have to code something that handles that? Probably. You're going to need to do it. So the user story doesn't tell you all of it. It tells you, if you're lucky, it tells you the full happy path. Most of the time, it doesn't cover negative paths, right? So you have to be thinking about those yourself. Because when you're coding it, you've got to do something with it. What are you going to do? Return an empty list, throw an exception, what are you going to do? Whatever you decide to do, you should test as well, right?
So even if it's kind of going off that, so if it's not specified, but you make a decision and then you test it, like if it said like, for example, like passing 0. If you say that you build something that says that it throws an error whenever when you return 0, which might not necessarily be an error, but that's how you coded it because it didn't tell you what to do.
Correct.
And if it doesn't specify in the requirements, is that something that will
touch base with a team member and say, generally, how are we handling these kind of situations? Okay. Or touch base with your team leader, whoever it is, and just get a feel for, or you might just search around for similar situations in the code and see how it's handled there. Generally, consistency is the important thing. So, so just use that as your guide. Now, for a perfectly delectable unit test, follow this secret formula. Not for Krabby Patties, but for supercharged unit tests. So, first thing you're going to do, in the story, read it carefully, just like we did here, and find all of the positive scenarios. Now, often, as I said, your user story isn't going to have negative scenarios in it. By positive scenarios, negative scenarios, I mean happy path and unhappy path, whatever. It often won't have negative paths, but it might have some. So if it does, note those down and note all the positive paths. And then don't write any unit tests. Create well-named stubs for each one. What do I mean by a stub?
A common method.
Yeah, just a method with no body, okay? So what you're doing here is you're mapping out a list of unit tests, working at this high level, not diving in, just working at this high level saying, okay, these tests cover that user story. Is that true or not? And now this requires you to name them very well. Name them specifically. Name them based on what you will be setting up and what you will be asserting, okay? And if that's really clear, then you can create these stubs and have a good global view. Now, that's not the end. The next step is to go into your tasks that were created under that user story and look at those tasks and see if those tasks map out negative scenarios. And then go and look at the code. Are there additional negative scenarios in the code? Write out stubs for every one of those you see. You with me? So the idea here is to work at that high level, get all that mapped out, and then when you're ready to code unit tests, you go in, you know exactly what you're doing. Boom, do it, right? So just dividing these up into different steps. Review and confirm that all the stubs exist for reasonable scenarios and begin coding. Make sense? Make sense? I think this will help you a lot in terms of verifying that you've got the right thing. So let's go into that a little bit. When I'm talking about user story testing, I'm saying, what should the code do? So this is kind of, this is referred to sometimes as black box testing. In other words, you don't see what's inside there. You don't care what's inside there, right? You're working from the user story, not from the code. Is there a benefit to that? What's the benefit of doing black box testing rather than working directly from the code?
All the scenarios, you just throw things at it. I mean, if you can't see the code, you can't see what it's intended to do.
Right. You can't. If you're coding from, if you're testing from the code, you're going to test what the code is already doing. You're not going to find out, does this user story match the code? Does the code implement that user story? So if you start first, black box, looking at that user story, you may find that there are scenarios that actually weren't even implemented, right? Or that were implemented without thinking. So now, how many of you have acceptance criteria in the user stories that you get? Okay, good, good. Is it good acceptance criteria? All right, that's fair. The acceptance criteria will help you a lot because the acceptance criteria is supposed to go a little deeper than the user story, right? It's supposed to say, you know, it's supposed to say, okay, it needs to do this. It needs to be able to do that. It needs to be able to do that. And if they're good user stories, each one ought to translate directly into a unit test, maybe a couple. You with me? That's what the acceptance criteria is. And if you look at behavior-driven development, what that is saying when you create your acceptance criteria, you at the very same time create those tests and tie tests directly to acceptance criteria. So there's a correspondence there. And you do it in a way that anyone can read, add scenarios to it, and verify that it all works. So that's not necessarily what we're doing here, but it is a good guide to keep in mind. These things should match. That will help you create your acceptance criteria as well, if you're involved in creating that. Make sense? All right. White box testing. Everyone, oh, little kitty cat in a box. Black box testing was the term that was originally used. And then someone wanted to say, well, it's also important to test based on what's in the code. And so they're like, well, what do we call that? Well, opposite of black, white box testing? Well, if a box is white, you still can't see inside of it. So maybe clear box testing is better, but people typically call it white box testing. Here you want to go for the detail, the tasks, and the code. Find stubs for all negative scenarios. Does your code somewhere throw an exception? Then it you'll darn well better be checking for that exception in a test. Does your code call parse, for example? What does parse do? Come on, what does parse do?
Like converts it to something, like if you like to parse an int or something, you're trying to change it from a string to an int.
Good, good. Parse is always for changing a string to something else, okay? The thing to know about parse is that if it fails, if you send it, quote, ABC, and you're trying to parse it into an integer, that's gonna fail, right? So how how does it respond when it fails? It throws an exception. Parse throws an exception. It's called a format exception, and you need to catch that if you're using parse. There's also another similar method called try parse, which does what?
Tries to do it.
It tries to do it and returns true or false, indicating whether it was successful or not. Okay, so either use try parse or use parse and make sure you're catching that exception. Right? There are other methods as well that throw exceptions that could reasonably happen in the course of your application running, and you should catch those exceptions as well. So we're not going for exhaustive here. We do want to catch common exceptions, but if you go into the documentation for the .NET framework, you can actually see that it shows every exception that this particular method could throw. Okay, and if you look up every method in your code that you're calling from the .NET framework, you might end up with a huge number of test cases. That's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to think about common scenarios and ways things could go wrong and determine what test cases work for that. Does that make sense? So black box testing, going directly from your user stories. White box or clear box testing, going from your code, from your tasks. All right, hunting unit test scenarios. Test each branch. Anybody know what method complexity means? Complexity score?
All the different possible ways to go through the method.
Right, all of the different possible paths through the method, okay? And if there are, 5 possible paths through this method, then that starts to be a pretty complex method, right? And the higher your complexity, I think that there's a way to get that in Visual Studio. I'm not quite sure. Anyone know? There's either in Visual Studio or ReSharper, I'm sure there's a way to get the complexity score for a function. It's not necessary because you should be able to look at the function and figure that out, okay? How many? This is one reason why clean coding means keeping your functions small. Now, this doesn't have to do with testing, but when I'm grading tests and I see really long methods, it makes me testy and not in a good way, right? So don't do that, right? Why? Why short methods?
It's harder to break short methods.
It's harder to break.
They're not so interdependent on each other.
That's right. That's right. And they can be more independent, and they can if they're well named, then a higher level function calls this, calls this, calls this, calls this. You read the names. You ought to read like a book, right? You ought to be able to see at a glance exactly what this code is doing. Small methods allow you to do that. And also, as a byproduct, small methods are easy to test, right? Because it's very clear what it's supposed to do. So, test various branches, test exceptions, .NET Framework libraries, test for null on return values from search functions or exceptions, whatever method that you've done, make sure all of that's covered. Now, I'm going to skip to a new topic now. Any other questions on white box testing, black box testing, the secret formula for creating supercharged unit tests? Okay, let me review this secret formula again. What's the first thing you do? You review it. You tell me. Stub what? User story. Go to your user story and stub out all of the things that the user story explicitly says. Positive scenarios usually, maybe a negative scenario or two. Stub all those out. Give them really good names, and then you have all those there. No bodies. Then what do? So that's black box testing, right?
Clear box.
Now we go to clear box or white box testing. What does that involve?
The task, you look at the code.
Look at the task, look at the code, and find those places where you're throwing exceptions. You're doing this, you're doing that. And all the scenarios that you need to test that. Okay? Now, let's move to a new topic, test names. I've already emphasized how important these test names are when you're doing your stubbing, right? But there are lots of reasons why test names are important. You may think, this method isn't even really called by me anywhere. What difference does it make what name it has? It makes a lot of difference. It allows you to identify issues. When issues arise, that's the whole point of the unit test, right? You want it to fail when something's changed and it's not right. You need good names to ensure that you can easily find and fix it, okay? What failed? Why? Without having to even detailed go through the code, the name should be very clear. Just like anything, any other code, naming is important for maintainability. When the code changes, as it always will, the test code changes, the test code needs to change. When you go to change the test code, you should be able to see at a glance, looking at all of these names, exactly what's being tested and where. Finally, Test Explorer that shows where your which test passed and failed. That's what's there, right? That's the method name that's there. It's not helpful in Test Explorer to see a bad name and it's failing. Well, what's failing, right? You need to have a clear understanding. Also, by the way, Samantha is a much better name than Gertrude. Just, I think that's objective. Yeah, I don't think anybody would disagree with that. All right, so method name components. This is generally how most teams across the board are naming their tests, and the way I think is a great way to do it. So the first thing, the first section is class name. Each of these sections is separated from the other with an underscore, right? So class name, repository. Now, in some test cases, it depends on your situation. You may just have the bottom three, but in some scenarios, you will have the class name as well. So method name, add transaction. Now, this isn't just vaguely, what are you doing in this test, right? This is the precise name of the function that is called in act, okay? I'm going to talk later about act, but act should be skinny, right? It should have, 90% of the time, it should have one method call, okay? If you've got other things, they probably should go in a range or in assert, okay? Assert can have more than just asserts in it, okay? Repository, add transaction. When transaction has invalid ID. Make this as English reading as possible. I dropped an "and" in there when a transaction has an invalid ID. Put them in there if you want. Articles, everything. Make it so that it reads like a human sentence, okay? Start with when, okay? I kind of would prefer a standard that dropped the when. You know the third option is when, so just assume that. But we're actually putting the whens in there, which is fine. And then should throw argument exception. Make sense? When this happens, this is the condition. This is the setup, okay? When all this is true, then this should be the result. What does this correspond to in the body of your test?
Assert.
The assert, okay? If this doesn't match very directly to your assert, then it's not named right, or the code's not right. With me? Make sense? All right, let's try another one. Class name, search engine, method name, search links. When links match search text, should return links. Okay, make sense? Make it English, make it clear. All right, so let's look at some of the, a few names, and we'll talk about whether they're good or not. Can you read this? Sorry. Payroll submit timesheet should throw exception for negative hours worked. Is that good?
When it's not specific enough.
Okay.
It should be like when you submit time sheet with negative hours or something like that.
So they've got the should first when it should be second, and third, they've run it all together, right? So what should this be? Want to take a stab at it?
So when negative hours work should throw exception.
When hours worked is negative or something like that, yeah. should throw exception. Should you just say throw exception? It'd be good if you said the type, right? So argument exception, format exception, whatever it is. There's no reason not to include that. Policy retrieve should return list of policies. Yeah, too many underscores. This is called, anybody know what this is called? Camel case, proper case, what is that called? What? Snake case, right? Because they're all joined together like a snake. Don't ever use this, ever, in your code, in your tests, anywhere that .NET code exists, this should not, okay? Sometimes people do this because they see underscores in tests, and so they think, all right, I should throw underscores in there, I don't know. The underscores should only be used, right, to divide up the sections, the 3 or 4 sections that you're using. Search engine, add. When sending sponsored link, should add non-sponsored link to list. First of all, is the format right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You should add sponsored.
So it doesn't make sense though.
Doesn't make sense. You're saying when sending a sponsored link, you should add a non-sponsored link. This happens.
It's really good if you want to broken everything.
Yeah. Why does this happen?
Copy paste.
Copy paste. That's exactly right. So you copied, you pasted it, you fixed this one, but you forgot about that one, okay? Is that harmless?
Yeah, sure.
Obviously, it is not harmless because now someone's coming in to maintain it. They're like, what the heck? And they don't know whether it's their brain malfunctioning or yours. Search engine, get my ID, when invalid, should throw exception.
What's invalid?
What's invalid mean? What does throw exception? What kind of exception? Okay. Specificity. Okay. A good name tells you what this is doing, what you're checking, and it also expresses how this test is different from other tests. Okay. The name should be unique and not because you used a synonym. Okay. Make sure that the name is specific enough so that you know what's what. All right, so we've got 2 here. Employee create, when home state is IN, should return valid instance. Employee create, when home state is Ohio, should return valid instance.
Are you testing for Ohio? Or is it for Indiana?
Right, you tested for Indiana. Is it likely that passing Ohio is going to make it return different instance in some way? No. And besides, if you accept 50 states, are you going to have 50 of these, right? So don't do that.
Yeah, copy paste right there.
Yeah, right, exactly. Oh, I got 300 tests. It must be good. No, it's not good. Isn't she cute? All right.
Her name's Samantha.
Is it?
I guess.
Actually,
it's,
you know
not,
what?
it's not Gertrude.
No, I think Samantha is her name. That's a good name for her. Do you know that they've done scientific studies and shown pictures to people and given them a list of names and had them match names to pictures? And across the board, people match them in exactly the same way. So to say someone looks like a Sam or looks like a Bob is a real thing that other people think and know as well. Isn't that strange? I think that's strange.
Are they right though? You said they match them in the same way, but are they?
Oh,
correct?
that's a good question. I don't know. The point is, we all think that they should.
Not really.
So if they aren't, it's just because their parents screwed up, right?
Clearly, your parents were wrong.
Yeah.
Just be Bob.
Yeah. You're clearly a Bob. Like you're clearly an Ian.
Exactly.
I mean, you couldn't have any other
There
name.
was not a chance.
All right, so now let's go on to another mistake, handling exceptions badly. All right, let's look at this code. We've got a test method and expected exception. What does the expected exception attribute do? Okay, it indicates that this method, if it's going to pass, must at some point throw the exception specified here, right? So it says expected exception, argument exception, policy not found. And then the name of the function is policy get ID, when ID unknown, throws argument exception. Pretty good name, okay? Arrange, create a policy controller, call the method get by ID, passing a 27, which presumably doesn't exist, and you're good. Anything wrong with that? What does this argument here do? Second argument of expansion.
Message that pops up when it doesn't fail.
Yeah. It's a message displayed essentially.
Okay, well, is this a good one then?
Not necessarily.
It's the ID, isn't it?
Here's what people, some people, a lot of people think, that this argument should have this message, and that it checks not only that that exception gets thrown, but that this message is correct. That is not what it does, okay? What it does instead is, if it doesn't throw that exception by the end of the function, it displays this in your test explorer, okay? In fact, virtually all of the assert methods have this text that you can optionally display in the test explorer, okay? But that it does not test. If the message comes up for argument exception as something completely different, this test still passes, okay? Because that's not what that does. Make sense? So how should you do this? I mean, yes, you want to check to see if the argument exception was thrown, but maybe you want to be more specific. I mean, an argument exception could mean a lot of things. So you want to find out that check that the message is actually right. One way to do that, is to do it this way. And I apologize again for the text being so small, but we've got policy get by ID. When passed unknown ID throws argument exception, try. Now notice there's no expected exception up there, right? Instead, we've replaced it with a try catch. If you've seen this before, you may have seen it in your code. It's something that Shiv recommends in his programming with intent class. And I think it's a good way to go. So try, instantiate the policy controller, call the get by ID method with 27. And then there's this line here. It says assert fail. Argument exception was expected, but none was thrown. Why?
There wasn't an exception thrown, then it's not acting properly.
What if you don't include that line? It will pass whether it throws the exception or not, right? If it throws the exception, it'll do the catch, it'll do that assert, and if that passes, it'll go on. If this isn't there though, and it gets to here and it doesn't throw the exception, it'll just go on and no exceptions thrown, so it's good. So this, if you're going to use this pattern, don't forget that. That is crucial to this pattern. Does that make sense? Sometimes you write a test and it passes and you don't look at that test anymore, right? Because it's passing. It does what it's supposed to do. Is it? So be sure. Does that make sense, this pattern? So again, then we get to check the message down here and make sure that it's what we expect. It's not quite as handy as the expected exception. It'd be nice if that second parameter did do what people think it does, but it doesn't. So that's where we're at. All right, next unit, testing mistake. Testing too many things. This is something that Aaron has been known to say. Minimize code coverage. Okay, that's the opposite of what you usually hear. You want high code coverage. But for a given test method, you should minimize the code coverage. Why? What am I saying there?
So your test is focused on something specific.
Exactly. Your test is focused on one specific thing, one specific path, whatever it is. So if this method has several possible paths through it, and the test method is 90% covered from this one test, you're testing way too many things in that one test. You with me? A test should test one thing, okay? Now, you might think one thing. That could really be ambiguous, right? What is one thing? It depends on what level you're working at, right? One thing could be a system that accepts policies and handles them appropriately. That's one thing. But usually when you get down to the level that you're working at unit tests, one thing should be pretty unambiguous, okay? When in doubt, err on the side of splitting it up, okay? Make the test small. Now, if you are typing in the name for your method, the should portion, and you find yourself should blah, blah, and blah, blah, and blah, blah, that should be a warning sign for you. Ands in there indicate you're trying to do more than one thing, right? So it's not always, mean it's wrong, but it's something that should make you think. So make the right asserts and no more. When you are done with a test, you may be inclined to just assert everything that should be true at that point. Do not do that, right? Instead, assert only the things that you're testing in this particular method. Why?
If something breaks, then you've got it narrowed down to a small focus. But if it's...
That is exactly right. If something breaks, ideally, it'd be great if only one test broke, right? Because then you can zero in on that test and know exactly where to go in the code to fix them. If 15 tests break, then that means too many tests are testing the same thing, right? Make them small, make them focused with as few asserts as is necessary to test the scenario. Another related topic is that your tests should all be small and fast. Keep in mind, we're going to have hundreds of tests, and these are going to run at the time of pull requests or more often. You don't want that to take hours, and generally it's not going to, but if you write code in your unit test that is going out to a file, it's going to the database, it's checking this, checking that, outside the system, calling a service, that test is going to be orders of magnitude slower than it would otherwise. Don't do any of those things. Also, if you're testing code which calls a service, that will also slow down. What should you do in that case? Mocks. That's what mocks are for. I'm not going to go into any detail on mocks because next week is a lunch and learn on mocks. So hope you're all there as well. So unit tests, test code within one class. The word unit test means a single unit. Again, that could be ambiguous, but in general, in an object-oriented language, it means a single class. And often what we're testing is a single method, right? If you need to call a couple methods in that class, like I want to add something and then get a list of some things to make sure it's in there, that's okay. But do not call methods in other classes, business classes, okay? We're testing one unit here. Any questions on these things? Does that make sense? These are all errors. I mean, everything I've talked about is errors I've seen in L2s, okay? So every one of these errors is made. Anybody know who that guy is? Not that guy, that guy? Oh, that's great. How many knew? That's great. He's like even before my time.
Were you concerned?
Huh?
Were you concerned?
I was a little. I don't know how you youngins think. You're not as much of a youngin though. These guys, youngins.
Thanks, man.
Sure. From an old dude to youngins. Worrying about test code duplication. When you're writing code, this is more or less ingrained into us since we've been in diapers. If you've got some code and then you're over here and you're writing code and you find yourself writing the same dozen lines of code, that's a sign maybe you want to create a separate method and call that method from both places. Everybody learn about that when they were in diapers? So should you do that in your unit test? It's going to be an ingrained kind of thing you're going to jump to because a lot of tests do the same thing or similar things, right? Hopefully not the same thing. Don't do it. Resist that urge. Why?
That should be autonomous.
Tests should be autonomous. That means, as much as possible, a given test ought to stand alone. You should not have to have other contexts supporting it. You certainly should never have a situation where this test has to be called before this test. Okay? Never should that happen. Also, I mean, in certain circumstances, you can put code in what's called a setup. Anybody know what the setup is? So if you have a setup method, that method doesn't get called at the beginning and then all the tests run. That's not what's happening. It's not a constructor. What's happening is that setup method gets called before each method gets called. So it's a brand new setup and then your method. Setup and then your method when it's called. Does that make sense? So sometimes you can put something in there. Say all the tests in this test class, are instantiating the policy controller because that's what they're testing. You could put in the setup policy controller equals new policy controller. Does that make sense? But generally try to keep it simple.
What about the cleanup method for tests as well?
I mean, generally those kind of things aren't necessary. I mean, if you have COM components or you've got other things outside that need to be closed or whatever, it's a little like the dispose pattern. I mean, if you have things outside that you've got a database connection and it really needs to be closed once all these tests are done, there may be other situations that are wrong with that, but anyways, then you can use that. But I think it's a lot less common because, again, .NET Framework is all about, just cleaning up after itself. Don't ever use the constructor, by the way. All right, now let's get into some smaller mistakes that I see, and I just wanted to mention. Trying to test privates. Your privates are none of anybody else's concern, okay? You should, under no circumstance, expose your privates. Now, this is in the context of testing, what I'm saying is that there's a method that's private. I want to write a unit test for it. Can I do that? Well, no, not easily. Some testing folks who are crazy will jump into VIL to try to sneak in there or use reflection to get to that method, even when it's private and so forth, or use other techniques. Don't do any of that, okay? First of all, it's way too complicated to maintain. Your test code should be very, very dirt simple. Why? Huh?
So it's fast.
So it's fast, and so that it's easy to maintain. When you're creating a code base for an application, that's large and gnarly and difficult to maintain. When you're creating a test suite that tests that application, that's going to have a certain amount of complexity just because the application does. Do you want 2 code bases to maintain? You do not. You do not want your development speed cut in half because you're developing a unit test application. So keep these dirt simple so that maintenance of them is not a problem. And this would add that kind of complexity. Don't bother. Instead, test private methods inside of a class through the public interface. Okay? Use the public interface to exercise those. Missing asserts. You know what? If you're ever coding a test and it's failing and you've tried to fix it and you can't, there's one guaranteed way to make it work. Take the asserts out. And it will pass every time. Well, not every time. I suppose if it throws an exception. But if you take the asserts out. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that make doubly, triply sure that your asserts are testing what you think they're testing. Okay? I see tests in L2 where someone does some convoluted thing and goes around the barn 3 times and then ends up typing assertions that test exactly nothing in the actual code base because they've gotten themselves confused. They have the wrong asserts in there and they're not testing anything. That can especially be true with mocks. Sometimes you can fall into a trap of testing your mock to make sure your mock works. It's not what this is about, right? Testing upstream functionality. Now, suppose I'm calling a function that does some stuff, and in that process of that calls this other function, which does stuff and returns it, and then I do some more stuff. Do I want to test that other function when I'm testing this function? The answer is no, you don't. Now, the ways of dealing with that might be a number of different ways of dealing with that, but remember, you're not testing anything but the method you're testing, okay? Stuff that it calls can be mocked out, or you can mess with it in certain other ways, but there's no reason to test that in addition to what you're testing, because you're going to test that later in its own test. Forgetting boundary cases. So this is something that we didn't, that some of you might have missed when we were first doing this. Well, you can pass an ID. Well, what if you pass 0? What if you pass a negative number? What if this? What if that? Now, you can go nuts testing boundary scenarios. There's really no end to it. But whenever it's a number, it's not a bad idea to pass 0, to pass a negative number, see what happens, okay? What should happen? Does what should happen happen? See what I'm saying? If you've got a range of values, it's often good to test the top and the bottom one. Might be good to test the top +1 and the bottom +1 and see if it fails appropriately. You see what I'm saying? So those are all good test cases. Leaving unused code. I don't like to see declarations, instantiations, and then never using that, okay? This happens all the time in tests. And it may be because, again, people don't have time to clean up or whatever, but why is that bad? Why is that more than just a minor nuisance? It's confusing, right? Maintainability. It goes straight to maintainability. If you declare it, then the person is going to have to spend a second or two figuring out, well, where does he use it? Oh, he doesn't use it. That's not a second and a half that they should have to spend. Don't leave commented out code in there. I see commented out lines. I see entire tests, methods that are commented out. This one is not passing. I'll comment it out. Now it's not a problem. Okay. I do not want to see commented out tests. You will get no credit for that at all. All right. Testing for handling of invalid arguments when values have already been validated earlier in the process. Y'all remember programming with intent? One of his big things there is you validate the code coming into the system. You absolutely do that. Then, through the rest of the system, you assume it's validated, right? You don't keep validating it at each level. That's what it's called defensive programming. And a lot of people were promoting it for a while. But you end up littering your code with this validation absolutely everywhere, and it's just not needed. If you know the inputs to your system, then you don't have to test those inputs every time. Okay? Likewise, you don't have to write tests to go through and test them every time. All right, so how much testing is too much testing? You might think, based on the kinds of stuff I've been saying here, I've been making recommendations for all kinds of tests that you should test. But there is a limit, and that limit is very important because I've seen situations in consulting where they introduced unit tests or automated unit tests or test-driven development or whatever, and they end up getting fired because the project starts taking twice or 3 times as long to produce the same functionality, okay? This happens when people who are new to unit testing think, oh, I need to test that, I need to test that, test everything. And they spend more time writing tests than they spend writing code, okay? So you do have to balance, and there's no hard and fast rules. Ask yourself, how likely is this scenario? Is this something that is likely to come up or not? Is it a real edge case? Also, ask yourself, how bad would it be if it failed? Okay? If it would be nothing more than a user interface tweak or whatever, maybe it's not as important. But these 2 variables are probably among the 2 most important things to consider when you're trying to figure out, do I need this test case? The most important point is to work closely with your team. Do some pair programming. Watch what other people do when they're writing tests and so forth, and try to mesh with your team and get some consistency going there. All right. Now, I just want to do a couple of examples here, and we'll be done. It's 1:30, so we're just now to the end of our hour. I'm going to spend maybe 10 more minutes talking about Ging and about how we apply these things to that application. You can see here that Ging looks beautiful, now has a logo and everything. This, by the way, is the same as the Bing logo, except for the little notch I put up there so that it looks like a G. So once you go Ging, of course, you'll never go back. Ging has the primary purpose is to allow you to search the web, right? To find links that might be interesting to you. So here's what a user story might look like. Given, how many of you use given, when, then? Okay, a few of you. Given, when, then is a common format that's done for user stories. It just helps you organize it. It's not critical, but it does help you think a little more clearly. So given that the user searches the links, when the user enters search text, then the system does a case-sensitive, insensitive search through descriptions and shows links that match the URL or description, and for non-sponsored links, the date added. I'm sorry, it shows these things. Okay, when it displays a matching link on there, it shows those three things, 2 or 3 things. The list should display sponsored links first, labeled as sponsored. Each time a sponsored link is shown, increment the impression count. Does that sound reasonable? So that's a somewhat lengthy user story. So, for example, we may want to say program UI search when string matching links is entered should show method matches with sponsored first. Is that good? Does that look okay? Am I trying to trick you? Yeah, I am. That's good. Anybody else think of other tests?
Sure, it displays the URL.
Okay, make sure it displays all 3 of these, or make sure it displays those 2, and then make sure if it's non-sponsored that it displays this. Okay, that would be good.
List return 0 if you don't have anything in it.
What if the list returns 0, like Google does all the time?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Actually, it does.
It's only a spelling issue for me.
Yeah. Sometimes it does return nothing. I'm like, it's usually when you use quotes in something really long.
Back away real slow in that.
That doesn't actually exist. No.
Can we check for if sponsored links don't display the date?
Make sure that sponsored doesn't display that. That's a very good test. Yes, absolutely. And remember those negative cases too. If you say this should happen in this and imply it doesn't happen for anything else, make sure it doesn't. Okay, that's a good one. What else? One other obvious one. Impression count. All right, so let's look at what's written up here. Search engine search, when string matching links is passed, should return a list of links with sponsored first. Wait, is that the same thing? Oh, what's different between these two?
The UI.
Yeah, this is a UI test and this is a business test, right? And so the wording is a little different. When you pass it, should return a list of links, not just display it, right? When sponsored link is found in search, should increment impression count. So, but you guys came up with some other good ones too. All right. When the user enters any kind of link, then the following information is requested: the type of link, sponsored or non-sponsored, and the URL and a description. When the user enters a sponsored link, the following additional information is required: name of the sponsor, cost per impression. When they enter a non-sponsored link, the following information is requested: date when the link was added, category, which is forum, blog, or other, right? So program UI add link. When user sponsored link should ask for appropriate data. And you might do the same thing for a non-sponsored link. What?
Better to specify, like not necessarily should ask for free, but like should ask for name and cost.
I wouldn't,
No.
because that could go on forever.
Okay, so
Yeah.
just keep it more generic.
Yeah, it's okay to, unless there's, between two tests, you're testing something slightly different than you would, but sometimes it's okay to step a little bit back because, you know, it gets crazy. Other things we should be testing here? Search engine. Now, business test, search engine add link. When link is passed, should add link to list. Now, let's look at the financials. When the user indicates they'd like to review the financials, a list of sponsored links with an impression count of greater than 0 is displayed, showing no more than 5 links total. Each should show URL, sponsor, current balance. When the current balance is to be displayed, then the value should be calculated by taking the cost per impression times the impression count.
How do you determine which 5 to show?
Which what?
How do you determine which 5 links to show?
Isn't that a question for the product owner?
It doesn't, yeah, it would be a question for the product owner. In this case, since it's not specified, if the product owner doesn't say different, any 5 links. Doesn't matter. That's the way the requirements were written in the original game, but you're right, in the real world, they would want something or sorted by whatever in the top 5. So financials, when sponsored links that have been searched, when sponsored links that have been searched, that's not good. When sponsored links exist that have been searched, that's what it should be. Should show links with correct balance. Yeah. What else?
Returning only sponsored links.
What?
Returning only sponsored links.
Okay. Well, it says when sponsored links. This one may be doing too much, right? You could check for sponsored links, and you could have a separate test that checks the correct balance, and you could have a separate test that checks that there's only 5, right? So that's going to be something you're going to have to decide. Like I said, in general, when in doubt, split it out. Hey, that's a slogan. When in doubt, split it out. Come to think of it, that doesn't sound very good. Yeah. Works for food too. When in doubt, spit it out.
Yeah.
Program UI financials. When many sponsored links exist, should show only 5. When some links have not been searched, only sponsored links with a balance appear. It's different. Like I said, there are several correct ways to split this out. And that doesn't mean that one's better than the other necessarily, as long as the key points are. Now, what have we been doing for these slides, for the last 3 slides? What kind of testing are we doing? What kind of stub writing are we doing? White box. No. Black box. No. Green box. Anyone?
I'll go with green.
Solid box.
Solid box, right? Black box, meaning we're not looking inside, right? We're just looking at the user story. So, oh, there's another one. When sponsored link with impression can exist, return links with correct balance, whatever. Okay, now let's go into some white box testing. This is the only one I'm going to do, but I want to show that when you start looking at the code, you might see code that looks like this. What's the first thing that should pop out at you that you need a test case for? Right, so throw new exception. Any throw new exception of any type, that's a good chance you're going to want a test case for that.
Make sure the cost is 0 before you
Okay.
start.
Yep. So that's how you would do it, right? You would set it to 0. What else? Or less than
Parse.
0.
So
What's that?
we have to parse.
Yeah, you've got to parse here. So that's going to throw a format exception. So you want to test for that as well. Does that make sense? So black box testing, white box testing, and a whole host of best practices. I'm going to put these slides out. You can find them on Confluence. Just go to the Center of Excellence dev page, and you'll be able to find them there. thoughts or questions? Thanks a lot.
Thank you.